Hello and welcome into the Well Actually podcast. I'm your host, Henry West. Today, we're going to go over a little bit of what this podcast is going to be about. I think there's a lot of information out there. We're in an age of information overload. There is a podcast or a Instagram page or a social media account of some variety about almost anything that you want from an information perspective. We have ChatGPT, we have Google, we have all of these sources of information. But the more that you look out there, the less there are information sources that are actually focused on truth and relating everything that's going on in the world back to a biblical perspective, back to what can we realistically glean from the Bible as far as what Jesus would say. There seems to be two categories of podcasts. There's shows about the Bible, or there's shows about current events, politics, sports, wellness, and there's very little crossover, for lack of a better term. You get a little bit of that out there, depending on where you're looking for it. Obviously, the Joe Rogan Experience has been around for a very long time, and he covers a really wide range of topics, but you're not getting a biblical perspective. I think, the only person that I can realistically remember being on Joe Rogan that was coming with an explicitly Christian perspective was Wes Huff, not too long ago. And Wes Huff is a brilliant, Christian apologist, and has a lot of valuable perspective to add. But, how many episodes has Joe Rogan done now? Like 2,500 at least. And, he brings a super valuable perspective to the space, but who's out there covering the wide range of topics that he covers, but covering them from a biblical perspective? Tucker Carlson is another big one in the conservative space that covers a pretty wide range of topics. I would consider myself I would consider myself a crotchety old man ultimately. But the thing about Tucker is that Tucker is a primarily political figure. And so even when you talk about, he'll start to broach certain subjects that would, maybe be health and wellness related. He recently did an episode with someone who was talking about brain health. He'll talk about, nicotine and the what he considers to be the positive benefits of nicotine. And he'll talk about, not getting the vaccine, etc. But when you're talking to when you're looking at his broad range, he is primarily focused on the political space, and he very clearly identifies as Christian, and I think you can see that in a lot of what he does. One of the things that he likes to say that I actually think is pretty spot on is, you can tell who's really interested in the truth by who's willing to admit that they're wrong and when they're wrong and apologize for it. And I think that too often to his point, very often people just kind of brush it under the table when they're wrong, and they just ignore the fact that they were wrong, and that, well, they're right now. They have the right opinion now. But you never hear from most people, you're not going to hear the perspective of, well, here's the thing. I thought this, now I think this. Here's what changed between now and then, and here's why I was wrong. And that is an insane, when's the last time you heard that in everyday life, let alone from a podcast host? So, I think there's a lot of important things and subjects and topics that he brings up, but it's not wide ranging. It is primarily in the political space. He's primarily interested in how is the government interacting with us on our day-to-day life? How does it impact us? What are the things that are going wrong in that, everyone's been negatively impacted by things that the government has done over the last 20 years. And if you haven't been negatively impacted, then you're lying. So, everyone's had some kind of negative impact in their life from some form of governmental policy. But that's not the, ultimately what I think is interesting is all of these different facets. When you look at the healthcare, so you look at the political space, you look at the, more of the podcast bro space. So, like Joe Rogan, all the comedians, Theo Vaughn, Andrew Schultz, Dave Smith, all those guys. You look at your more traditional conservative people, the people over at the Daily Wire, your Turning Point USA, your Charlie Kirk. You look at the Young Turks. You look at all these places and they're all kind of pointing at something. And that something is essentially that, we clearly as a society have something that fills us. Look at any available measure of happiness, of fulfillment, of cultural. You can look at these as an individual at a level, or you can look at these at a societal level. And every measure that we have says that we are becoming a sick society, and daily it grows worse. Everyone is out here to some degree trying to, well, this is what's wrong. You have a certain group of people that's out there that's going to be like, well, if we just had an honest government that took care of the things and put America first, then we could create an environment where people would thrive. And you have people out there who say, if we could just created a social net for people where, people could afford to take risks and not worry about losing their house and feeding their kids, then we'd be okay and people would be happy. If people were just allowed to say what they wanted to say and, the marketplace of ideas was allowed to move forward, then society would be fixed and people would be happy. Or, if we just took better care of our bodies and we were healthier and we worked out more and we optimized human performance more and we got back to being healthy, well, then people would be happy. And we just have a health problem. We have a mental health epidemic. And, if we just fixed people's mental health, then, we'd all be fine. And I think what's interesting about all of these is in many ways, they're all interconnected, but I don't think that they fully address, what actually builds us as a society. I think these are all steps that we can take. I think there's all tons of different things. And I think that we need to have opinions and comment and investigate all of these things. But I do think that ultimately, when it comes down to it, all of these things, at the end of the day, they point back to a society that has become godless. The more that we investigate this, I think the more we will actually discover that as soon as we turned our backs as a society on Jesus Christ and the message that he brought, and the message that really, if we're being honest, that this country was built on, I think we'd find a lot of solutions to these problems. And I think what's interesting is that if you look at through a biblical lens, the Bible gives us perspective on all of these different things, but it also gives us a very clear answer on what the most important thing is. And I think we focused on the most, you have to put the first thing first, get the first thing in place, and then we can focus on all the little things. So, ultimately what I want to do is I want to take that biblical lens and I want to apply it to all these things. Like, we should be applying, what does the Bible have to say about health? What does the Bible have to say about wellness? What does the Bible have to say about mental health? What does the Bible have to say about politics? And what we should expect from our government? I think, what we'd find is that neither the conservatives nor the liberals have brought a true biblical perspective to the world of government. But we need to address that because there's, while that is true, I think it's also very clear that one political party has very clearly espoused a demonic ideology. And that's something that we need to talk about. Why is that taboo? Again, if you take a step back and you quit looking at things through all of the little lenses that we're given in life, whether that's ChatGPT or Grok or all of these different things. If you truly take a step back and you remove all of those different lenses and you look at it only through the biblical lens and you evaluate it from the perspective of, obviously as best we can, we're all flawed individuals. But if you're really doing your best to evaluate it from the perspective of, am I looking at this through the lens of the character and identity of Jesus? I think a lot of the answers to these issues become pretty dang obvious, So again, that is what I intend to do. And we're going to cover everything again from wellness, from health to, economic policy to foreign policy to governmental policy to immigration policy to marriage and why half of our marriages are just a complete dumpster fire. And that's just the half that are reportedly a dumpster fire. It's probably more like 75% of all marriages in the United States are an absolute dumpster fire. Just go walk around your grocery store for 5 minutes and you'll see it's a nightmare. And you see the way people talk to each other, and it is just absolute. And by people talking to each other, I mean their spouses, like the people that they profess to love most in the world. And they're talking to them like they're the person that they hate most in the world. And so, that's something that has to be addressed. We're going to address the naughty topics like LGBTQ and all of that nonsense. I'm guessing you can figure out where I stand on a lot of that. We're going to talk about parenting. If we want our country and our society to thrive, we have to get back to a focus on what do our families look like? What does it look like to parent? What does it look like to parent in a way that Jesus would be proud of that? Again, a lot of these topics are going to be hot button issues like abortion, all of these different things. And again, like ultimately, when it comes to addressing these issues, what the goal is going to be is to find a balance between looking at these issues through the lens of the grace that Jesus has given us on these issues. The story of the Bible in a lot of ways is the story, it's a redemption story, but it's a story of, a groom in Jesus and a bride in all of humanity, and a bride that has spit in the face of Jesus and I mean, we've done as humanity, we've done these horrible things, and Jesus continually pours out his grace for us. But we also have to balance that grace with the justice that comes along with the nature of God. And so when you're talking about looking through these issues, I think more often than not, we get really caught up in either the grace side or the truth side. And then sometimes both of those sides become even more warped and even more crazy, to the point where, we're not looking at things clearly anymore. And we're not looking at things through the lens that Jesus gives us. And so, my goal is to look at all of these things and take into perspective, like look at all the perspectives that are out there, but ultimately come back to the one lens that we have, which is the Bible, the lens that Jesus has given us, and take things back and evaluate things through a lens of justice and grace, and figure out how we can look at all of these issues and find solves for them. And obviously we'll look at these things at a grand scale of the world. Like, I think it's very easy for us as people to get caught up in what things that we can't control. Like, and we're still going to look at those things. We're still going to look at, okay, like how should we as Christians look at the situation in Gaza and how that has declined, and the treatment of Palestinian people, who are people made in God's image, by the way, and the treatment of the Palestinian people at the hands of the Israelis, while also maintaining a biblical lens and looking at things of like, how did things get here? What's the historical perspective here? What's the biblical perspective here? And how can we take those things and understand how we got here, and also understand, okay, where should we as Christians fall in something like that? But also understanding that ultimately, me as a guy in Cincinnati, Ohio, I'm not going to be making any decisions anytime soon that affect Benjamin Netanyahu and his policy towards Palestine. I mean, that's just not happening. And no matter how much anyone wants to go out in the streets and scream about it, there's been a lot of screaming in the streets and a lot of screaming on podcasts. As far as I can tell, nothing's changed. Public opinion really only has so much influence. But what we do have power over is how we raise our children and all of those things at a smaller level. And I think what needs to be understood is that if 1 million people make 1 million small decisions that change 5 million people's lives, that is a world-changing impact. It doesn't have to be one person that's making this grand impact to stop some sort of global issue. Where we can make an impact, and where all of us, all of you can make an impact, is what choices am I making on a daily basis that impact the way the next generation is going to grow? And how can I make little choices every single day that actually move the impact of the kingdom of Jesus forward? And that's where we want to get to on all of these little bits. So if that sounds interesting to you, if that sounds fun to you, if that sounds like something that you can get on board with, and stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks so much.